The watch landed on the kitchen table with a sound like a gunshot. Miriam Oleander did not move. She stood at the stove with her back turned, a cast iron spoon in her hand, and she listened to that small metallic clatter settle into silence the way a stone settles to the bottom of a river. She already knew what it was. She had known the moment she heard boots on her porch, boots that did not belong to any man from Caldwell Creek, boots that moved too carefully, too deliberately, the way a man moves when he is carrying something that does not belong to him and knows it. She turned. The man standing in her doorway was tall and lean in the way that comes not from youth, but from years of surviving on very little. He wore a dusty long coat the color of charcoal and a hat that had seen better decades. His eyes were gray, the kind of gray that held no warmth but also told no lies. He had not drawn his weapon. He had not spoken a single word. He had simply placed the watch on her table and taken one step back, as if returning something stolen, as if he were the kind of man who understood exactly the weight of what he was setting down. Miriam looked at the watch. The silver casing was scratched in the same 3 places she had memorized. The engraving on the back still read, "To Daniel, who carries my heart wherever he rides." She had written those words herself. She had taken the watch to the jeweler in Dodge City on a Tuesday in the spring of 1878, the same spring she had believed everything in her life was beginning rather than ending. Her knees went strange beneath her. She gripped the edge of the table. "Where did you get this?" she said, and it was not a question the way she said it. It was an accusation. It was a reckoning. It was every single night she had spent in the past 8 months wondering whether Daniel Oleander had died bravely or whether he had died afraid, wondering whether anyone had been kind to him at the end, wondering whether his body was buried decently somewhere, or whether the coyotes and the Kansas wind had settled that matter for her. The man in the doorway removed his hat. "I was with him," he said. "At the end, he asked me to bring it back to you." "Tell me," she said. "Tell me everything." That was the first thing Miriam Oleander said to Tobias Bright. It would not be the last thing she said to him that changed everything. The year was 1879. The place was a stretch of southern Kansas prairie so flat and wide that a person could see a storm coming from 3 counties away, and still not have time to make peace with it before it arrived. The town of Caldwell Creek sat 6 miles northeast of the Kansas Indian Territory border and considered itself respectable, though it had more saloons than churches and more unmarked graves than named streets. It was the kind of town that the railroad had almost touched and then thought better of, which left it in that particular state of arrested ambition that breeds both stubbornness and desperation in equal measure. Daniel Oleander had come to Caldwell Creek in the spring of 1873 with $30, a strong back, and a talent for coaxing grain from reluctant soil. He had built the farmhouse board by board. He had married Miriam Cassidy in the summer of 1874, when she was 22, and he was 26, in a ceremony behind the Methodist church with 16 people in attendance and a borrowed ring they later replaced with a proper one. Their daughter, Clara, had arrived in the winter of 1872, born early and small but fierce, and had grown into a child who talked to the chickens as though they were colleagues and read everything she could lay her hands on, which in Caldwell Creek was not much but included 2 almanacs, a Bible, a dime novel about Kit Carson that she found in the barn, and every letter that arrived at the general store whether it was addressed to her or not. Daniel had been killed in October of 1878. That was the official record. The cause of death listed by the county was robbery, though the deputy who filed the report was a man named Holt Greer who drank too much and asked too few questions. and Miriam had never fully believed that the story she had been given was the complete one. What she had been told was that Daniel had gone to Medicine Lodge to settle a debt and had not come back. What she had been told was that he was found on the side of the road with his horse gone and his pockets turned out. What she had not been told, because no one had known to tell her, was that a man named Tobias Bright had been on that same road and had found Daniel Oleander not yet dead but close enough that there was no reversing what had been done to him. Tobias had knelt in the road dust with a dying stranger and held his hand and listened to him speak, because that was the only thing left to offer. Daniel had spoken his wife's name 7 times. He had described the farm in enough detail that Tobias could have found it in the dark. He had said that there was a watch in his coat pocket, and that the watch needed to go back to her, that she would know by the engraving what it meant, that she would know he had been thinking of her. He had said that his daughter was named Clara, and that she had her mother's temper and his mother's eyes. He had said nothing about who had done this to him, or if he had said something, he had said it too quietly at the very end, and Tobias had not been able to make out the words over the sound of the wind in the grass. Tobias had buried him. He had done it properly, marking the place with a flat stone he carried from the creek bed, and he had taken the watch. He had intended to return it immediately. He had not, for reasons that had everything to do with what Daniel had not said and very little to do with cowardice, though there was some of that too. Tobias Bright was a man who had spent the better part of 12 years moving through the West in the spaces between things, never quite belonging anywhere, never quite settling, carrying a history he did not often discuss in towns where history had a way of catching up to a man at inconvenient moments. He had been many things before he arrived in that particular stretch of road in October of 1878. Some of those things he was not proud of. None of them, he believed with something close to conviction, had involved cruelty for its own sake. But the line between what a man told himself about himself and what he actually was had always seemed to Tobias like the kind of line that blurred in low light. He had kept the watch for 8 months because returning it meant arriving on a widow's doorstep with news that was already old, and he had not known how to do that. He was a man who was very good at handling situations that required speed and decisiveness, and very poor at handling situations that required the kind of slow, deliberate courage that walking up to a woman's door demanded. What finally moved him was not conscience, though conscience played a role. What finally moved him was a man in a Caldwell Creek saloon named Ruddy Fane, who had been drinking since midday and who had said, without particular shame and within earshot of several people including Tobias, that the Oleander widow would need to sell that farm by harvest or lose it to the bank, and that he intended to be first in line when she did because the land was the only good thing about the situation, and the woman would be grateful for the offer. Tobias had set down his glass and walked out of the saloon and gone directly to the livery and gotten his horse, and he had ridden the 6 miles to the Oleander farm without stopping. He told Miriam all of this. Not immediately, and not all at once, but over the course of an evening that began with her asking him to sit down because her legs were unsteady and ended with the 2 of them at her kitchen table long after Clara had been put to bed, the lamp burning low, the watch sitting between them on the table like a third party to the conversation. He told her about the road and about Daniel, and about what Daniel had said. He did not tell her yet about what he suspected regarding who had done it, because he was not certain enough to speak, and because he could see that she had taken in as much as she could hold for one night. He told her about burying him, and where the stone was so that she could go there if she needed to. He said her name, Miriam said. Clara. 3 times, Tobias said. He said it like he was proud of it, like it was the most important word he knew. Miriam looked at the watch. "You kept this for 8 months," she said. "Yes," he said. He did not offer an excuse. She looked at him with those direct green eyes that had been assessing him all evening, that had been measuring him the way a woman who has survived a lot measures the people who arrive at her door, and she said, "Why did you come now?" He told her about Ruddy Fane and what Fane had said in the saloon. The expression on her face shifted in a way that was difficult to read. It was not gratitude, not entirely. It was something sharper than that, something that had edges. "I'm aware of Ruddy Fane," she said. "I imagine you are." "I do not need saving," she said. "No," he said. "I can see that." There was a silence between them that was not uncomfortable. Tobias found this surprising. He was not accustomed to silences with people he had just met that were anything other than cautious, careful, calculated. The silence in Miriam Oleander's kitchen felt like something else. It felt like the kind of silence that only exists between people who are already, without having decided to be, telling each other the truth. "You can sleep in the barn," she said finally. "It is late, and the road back to town is dark," he nodded. "And tomorrow," she said, picking up the watch and closing her fingers around it the way you close your fingers around something you thought you had lost forever, "you will tell me the rest of what you know." He looked at her. "There is a rest," she said. It was not a question. She had known since approximately the third sentence he had spoken that there was more, that the story of Daniel's death had layers to it that had not been examined, that the convenience of the official account had always bothered her the way a splinter bothers long after the skin has closed over it. "Yes," he said. "Tomorrow then," she said. He went to the barn. He lay in the clean hay in the dark, and listened to the Kansas wind move across the roof, and thought about how a man could travel 100,000 miles and still find himself, without explanation, exactly where he was supposed to be. Clara found him in the morning before the sun was fully up. She was 6 years old and possessed of the particular fearlessness that children develop when they grow up watching their mother be afraid of nothing. And she stood in the barn doorway with a piece of bread in one hand and studied him with a directness that reminded him, with a start that settled somewhere in his chest, of her mother. "You are the man from last night," she said. "I am," he said. "My mother said you knew my father." "I did, a little. Was he kind to you?" Tobias looked at her. "He was." She considered this. "He was kind to everyone," she said with the authority of a person reporting a fact. "Mama says so." "I don't remember much because I was little, but I remember that he sang when he was working." She offered him the bread. "Are you hungry?" He was, as it happened, quite hungry. He took the bread. "I am Tobias Bright," he said. "I know," she said. "Mama told me." She said to ask if you take milk in your coffee. The domesticity of this hit him somewhere unexpected. "Yes," he said, "if there is some to spare." "We have a cow," Clara said, with a satisfaction that suggested the cow was a personal achievement. "Her name is Margaret. I named her." Mama wanted to call her something useful, but I told her that milk is already useful, so she doesn't need a useful name, and Mama said that was fair. He smiled. He had not smiled before 8 in the morning in longer than he could specifically remember. When Clara was sent out to collect eggs with the practiced resignation of a child who knows she is being given a task so that adults can talk, Miriam sat down across from him with her hands around her coffee cup and said, "Tell me the rest." So he did. The rest was this. Tobias had been in Caldwell Creek for 2 days before riding out on that October road. He had been there on his own business, which in those days was the kind of business that did not benefit from close examination, though it was not illegal, or not straightforwardly so. He had been asked by a man in Wichita to look into the activities of a cattle operation near the border that was suspected of not being entirely what it represented itself as. The name of the man who ran that operation was Warren Aldous. Aldous was respected in Caldwell Creek the way powerful men in small towns are respected, which is to say that his respect had a quality of weight to it that made people reluctant to contradict it. He owned the largest ranch in the county. He employed a significant portion of the town's working men, and he had a relationship with the county sheriff that was cordial in ways that should perhaps have raised more questions than it did. Tobias had learned in his 2 days in Caldwell Creek that Daniel Oleander had been to see Aldous the week before his death. He had learned this from a woman at the boarding house who talked a great deal and whose information, while sometimes exaggerated, was grounded in specific observation. He had learned that the visit had not been friendly. He had not learned yet why. "Did Daniel tell you he was going to see Aldous?" Tobias asked. Miriam's expression changed. Something behind her eyes went very still in the way that things go still when a person is assembling pieces they have had separately for some time and are only now understanding how they fit together. "He found something," she said slowly, "on the south pasture near the border. He never told me exactly what it was. He said he needed to speak to someone in town first and then he would tell me, and I was so occupied with getting the last of the harvest in that I did not push him on it." She looked at the table. "I have thought about that every day since, every single day." "You could not have known," Tobias said. "I know I could not have known," she said, with a sharpness that was not directed at him but at the general impossibility of the situation. Knowing a thing and living with it are different matters. He understood that. He understood it in a way that came from his own history of knowing things and living with them. "You still have the land?" he asked. "The south pasture?" "For now," she said. "The bank has been patient but not indefinitely. I have until November. The harvest this year has been better than last year but not by enough." "And Aldous, has he approached you?" She looked at him with a steadiness that was impressive. "Twice. He sent men, not himself, very polite, very clear about what a burden the farm must be for a woman alone. Very generous with an offer that was about 40% of what the land is actually worth. And you said no." "I said no," she said, "both times." He nodded. "You know what Daniel found?" he asked. "I went and looked," she said, after everything. "I looked at the south pasture 100 times, and I found nothing that seemed worth dying over, but I am also not certain I knew what I was looking for." She paused. "There was a section of fence that had been repaired. Someone had done it after Daniel died. I noticed because Daniel had a particular way of stringing wire, and whoever did the repair did it differently. This was more useful than she knew. Or perhaps, he thought, looking at her, she knew exactly how useful it was and was watching to see what he did with it." "What's on the other side of that fence?" he asked. "Indian territory," she said. They sat with this. The situation, as Tobias understood it now, had the specific logic of corruption in unsettled country. The border between Kansas and the Indian Territory was many things, but it was above all a legal line that complicated the movement of cattle, among other things. A man who controlled land on the Kansas side of that border had, if he were inclined toward certain activities, considerable opportunity. The Oleander Farm south pasture was a natural funnel point. Daniel had found evidence of something, had gone to confront or report it, and had died for it. The fence had been repaired to remove whatever evidence remained. The question was what to do about this now, in 1879, in a county where the official apparatus of law was not reliably on the right side of things. "Greer," Miriam said, naming the deputy before he could raise the question, "is useless at best and involved at worst." The county sheriff in Caldwell is a man named Pryor who is Aldis's hunting partner. There is a federal marshal's office in Wichita, but I have no proof and no money for a lawyer and no one who will speak on my behalf. I have a contact in Wichita, Tobias said. She looked at him with the measuring expression again. Who are you exactly? She said. It was a fair question. He took a moment to consider how to answer it honestly without overwhelming her with information that would require more trust than they had yet earned with each other. I am a man who has spent a long time working in the space between what is legal and what is just, he said, which sometimes overlap and sometimes do not. The man in Wichita who hired me to look into Aldis is a legitimate businessman whose cattle have been stolen by a method I believe involves your south pasture. He has means and motivation to bring what I find to the right federal attention. He does not have proof yet. And you think finding out what Daniel found would provide that proof? I think it is possible. She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, they could hear Clara having a conversation with one of the chickens about the ethics of egg removal. Why? Miriam said. He looked at her. Why would you do this? She said. You brought me the watch. You've done what you promised Daniel. You have your own reasons for looking into Aldis that have nothing to do with me. Why are you sitting at my table telling me this instead of going and looking on your own? It was, he thought, the most important question anyone had asked him in a long time. Because, he said, and then he stopped, because the honest answer was one he needed to examine before he said it. He thought about the saloon and Ruddy Fane and what Fane had said. He thought about the 8 months he had carried the watch and the strange weight of it, not physical but something else. The weight of an obligation that had become, over those months, something more than obligation. He thought about sitting in this kitchen this morning drinking coffee while a 6-year-old lectured him about cows, and how it had felt like something he did not have a word for. Because you deserve to know what happened to your husband, he said finally. And because the people who did it should not profit from it, and because I am already here. It was not the complete truth, but it was true. She nodded slowly. All right, she said. Then you should also know that I have been keeping notes. Every suspicious thing I have noticed in the past 8 months I have written down. I have 3 pages. He stared at her. I am not a fool, she said quietly. I have known since the beginning that what they told me was not the whole story. I have been waiting for someone to tell me the truth, so I would know whether the things I had noticed were evidence, or whether I was simply a grieving woman seeing patterns in coincidence. They are evidence, he said. She got up and went to a box on the shelf above the fireplace and took out a folded piece of paper, and she brought it to him and set it down on the table between them where the watch had been the night before. He read it carefully. It was methodical and specific and absolutely useless in a court of law as it currently stood, but as a map of what to look for, it was better than anything he had assembled on his own. You are remarkable, he said without thinking about it, and then was slightly surprised that he had said it out loud. She sat down and there was a faint color in her face that was not embarrassment but was adjacent to it. I am a woman who needed answers, she said. It is not remarkable to want answers. It is remarkable, he said, to spend 8 months gathering them methodically and alone without any certainty that they would ever be useful. She looked at the paper on the table and then at him, and something in the space between them shifted in a way that was small but definite. The way the light changes at a particular moment in the late afternoon, when it stops being afternoon and starts being evening. You can stay, she said, while we figure this out, in the barn. I will not have people talking, but I also cannot manage this alone, and you know things I don't. She met his eyes. And there is the matter of Ruddy Fane, who will not be the last person to make an offer on this land if he learns I am still in difficulty. "I will stay as long as you need me to," he said. This was the promise that, like all promises made in kitchens in the early morning over coffee, held more weight than anyone fully understood at the time of making it. The days that followed had the particular quality of time that passes both slowly and quickly when a person is occupied with something that matters. Tobias slept in the barn and worked the farm during the hours when working the farm was what was needed, because the harvest did not stop for investigation, and Miriam could not do everything alone. He learned quickly that he was a competent farmer in the practical sense, without having the deep, instinctive relationship with the land that someone like Daniel had clearly had. And Miriam corrected him when he was wrong without cruelty, but also without softening, which he found he preferred to politeness. Clara adopted him with the thoroughness that children bring to decisions that adults have not yet made. She explained to him at length the specific personalities of all the chickens, which he listened to seriously, because she was serious about it. She showed him the almanac and asked him questions about things she had read that she had not been able to ask anyone since her father died, because her mother, while extremely capable, was occupied with survival in ways that left little room for the question of whether it was true that you could predict rain by looking at the color of the sky at sunset. He answered what he could. He said honestly when he did not know. He noticed that Clara never mentioned missing her father directly. She mentioned him often, in the factual way she had mentioned him to Tobias in the barn that first morning, as if Daniel Oleander were a person whose existence remained constant even though his physical presence had ended. He was not sure whether this was a child's way of grieving or a particular kind of strength that the Oleander women shared, this habit of continuing to carry the people they loved without being destroyed by the carrying. In the evenings, after Clara was in bed, he and Miriam sat at the kitchen table and went through her notes and through what he knew, and they built, slowly, carefully, a picture of what Warren Aldous had been doing. It was this. There was a section of the Indian Territory border where Aldous had been moving stolen cattle south into the territory, and then, through arrangements with certain parties who were neither fully legitimized nor fully accountable, moving them north again with different brands and documentation. The Oleander South pasture had been used as a staging area without Daniel's knowledge or consent, and Daniel had stumbled onto the evidence of this, probably a gather of cattle in the pasture at night and brands he did not recognize, and had made the mistake of going to Aldous about it rather than directly to federal authority. The men who had killed Daniel were not Aldous directly. They were men who worked for Aldous, specifically a pair named Cutter and Bren, whose activities Tobias had been tracking separately in connection with the Wichita complaint. Cutter had been seen in Caldwell Creek in October of 1878 by at least 2 people, one of whom had written this down in a letter to a relative, and one of whom was the boarding house woman who talked a great deal. It was Miriam who pointed out that the boarding house woman's name was Frances Doyle, and that she was not simply a gossip, but a very specific observer who had, before her husband's death, kept accounts for a dry goods operation in Missouri, and had a memory for numbers, dates, and faces that was professional in quality. "Have you spoken to her?" Tobias asked. "3 times, Miriam said. "She is willing to speak to a federal authority but not to local law. She has her own reasons for being careful around Greer." "What reasons?" Miriam looked at him steadily. Her husband's death was also ruled a robbery. 2 years before Daniel's. The weight of this landed between them with a thud that neither of them needed to comment on for a moment. "There are more," Miriam said quietly. "I believe there are more. The Aldous operation has been running for years. Daniel was simply the most recent and the most local." He watched her face as she said this. The anger in it was very controlled, the kind of anger that has been controlled for so long that it has become structural, load-bearing. He thought about how she had said on the first night that she did not need saving, and he understood that this was not pride. It was precision. She had survived 8 months of being in immediate proximity to the people who had destroyed her life, and had done so with a composure that was not detachment but its opposite. She cared so much that she had made herself a weapon of observation. "We need to write to Wichita," he said. "Everything. All of it, with your notes and Francis Doyle's testimony and my own account. And then, the federal marshal's office has jurisdiction that Pryor and Greer do not, and the man in Wichita has resources I do not. And we build a case that does not give Aldous any avenue to shut it down before it reaches someone with actual authority." She nodded. "How long?" "It depends on how quickly they move. Weeks, maybe longer." She looked at the table. "I have until November with the bank." "I know." He said this carefully. "I have some money, not a great deal, but enough for a loan payment if it comes to that." He stopped because her expression had shifted to something that was very clearly refusal. "I am not offering charity," he said, before she could speak. "I am offering a practical arrangement. I am currently sleeping in your barn and eating at your table and using your farm as a base of operations for something that serves my interests as well as yours. It is not unreasonable." She looked at him for a long time. "I will accept it as a loan," she said, "with interest." "Agreed," he said. "Though the interest rate I would accept is very low." "The interest rate I would pay," she said, with a composure that was just barely over the line into dignity, "is fair market. I will not be in debt to anyone on terms that are not fair." "Fair market it is," he said, and something in his chest did a complicated thing that he was not ready to examine directly. They wrote the letter to Wichita together, over 2 evenings, because it needed to be right. He wrote the parts that required his professional credibility, and she wrote the parts that required specificity and local knowledge. And when they read it back together, it was better than either of them could have made alone. He rode to Caldwell Creek to post it at a time of day when the fewest people would see him doing so, because attracting Aldis's attention before the federal response arrived would be a specific kind of disaster. What he did not account for was Ruddy Fane. Fane had been watching the Oleander farm. He was not subtle about this, being the kind of man who believed that visibility was a form of pressure, and he appeared on the edge of the property twice in the week after Tobias posted the letter, riding along the fence line and looking at the operation with the proprietary squint of a man already measuring for changes. The second time, Miriam was outside and saw him and said nothing, only looked back at him with an expression that would have given a more perceptive man pause. Fane was not a more perceptive man. The third time, he came to the door. Tobias was in the barn working on a wheel that had cracked, which was a task that was mundane enough to be almost meditative, and he heard Fane's voice before he heard what Fane was saying. Heard the specific aggressive cheerfulness of a man who considers himself charming and has not spent enough time around women who disagree with this assessment. He set down the wheel and walked to the barn door and stood where he could see the porch without being immediately visible from it. Miriam stood in her doorway with her arms crossed, and her expression the way it got when she was controlling something large and keeping it from showing, which he had come to recognize in the past 2 weeks as the specific combination of her chin lifting slightly and her hands becoming very still. Fane was offering to help her with the harvest. He was suggesting that a woman in her situation could use a friend with resources. He was wrapping the same threat he had been wrapping for 8 months in new paper and presenting it as generosity. Miriam said, "Thank you, Mr. Fane, but I have the harvest well in hand." Fane said, in a tone that was the audible equivalent of not quite believing her. Alone. That is a great deal for one woman. I am not alone, Miriam said, and looked directly past Fane to where Tobias was standing in the barn doorway. Fane turned. The two men looked at each other across 30 feet of Kansas yard in the clear October light. Tobias did not move toward him and did not speak. He simply stood, in the way he had learned over many years to stand when he needed a situation to resolve itself without escalating it, with a stillness that communicated without threatening. Fane looked at him. Then he looked back at Miriam. Then he looked at Tobias again. "Who is that?" he said. "A friend," Miriam said simply. Fane left. He did not leave graciously, and the look he gave Tobias on the way to his horse was the kind of look that is an announcement rather than a farewell, the kind that says this is not over as clearly as words would. But he left. Tobias walked across the yard. He stopped at the porch steps. "Are you all right?" he said. "Yes," she said, "though I suspect we have complicated things." He was already complicated, Tobias said. He is not the kind of man who accepts no indefinitely. "No," she agreed. She was looking at him in a way that was different from the measuring look. This was something else, something that was more direct and at the same time more careful. "Thank you for being visible," she said. "That is the right word for what you did. You did not interfere, but you were visible." "You did not need interference," he said. "No," she said, "but the visible part helped." She went back inside. He stood on the porch step for a moment in the October sun, and thought about the particular sensation of being useful to someone in a way that did not require diminishing them, and how unfamiliar and also how exactly right it felt. Clara appeared behind Miriam in the doorway and said, "Is that man gone?" "He is," Miriam said. "Good," Clara said with a finality that clearly had history behind it. "I do not like him. His horse doesn't like him either. You can always tell." Tobias looked at Clara and then at Miriam, who was attempting to maintain a neutral expression at her daughter's assessment. "She is not wrong," Tobias said. "About horses." "I know," Miriam said, and the expression escaped neutrality for a moment and became something that on another face in another context he would have called a smile. But on Miriam Oleander in that moment, it was more than that. It was the specific softening of a face that has been holding itself carefully for a very long time and has just, for 1 second, allowed itself to rest. He thought about that expression for a considerable amount of the evening afterward. The response from Wichita came in the 3rd week of October, which was faster than he had expected and confirmed his estimation of the man who had sent him south in the first place. The letter was from a federal deputy marshal named Caldwell, which was a coincidence of naming that Clara found extremely funny when Miriam read parts of the letter aloud at dinner. And it said that 2 marshals would be coming south within the fortnight, and that Tobias's account, combined with what they had already assembled from the Wichita end, was sufficient to begin a formal investigation. It also said something that Tobias had not anticipated, and that changed the shape of what came next. It said that among the things the Wichita investigation had uncovered was evidence that Warren Aldis had a business partner in Caldwell Creek, whose role had been to provide local protection, and whose name was Deputy Holt Greer. Miriam read this line twice. Then she set the letter down. "Greer," she said, not with surprise exactly, but with the particular sound of a thing that has been suspected for a long time being confirmed. "He filed the report on Daniel," Tobias said. "He told me it was a robbery," she said. "He told me they were looking into it. He came to this house twice in the first month." She stopped. "He came here, to this house. I know. He sat at this table." There was a quality to her stillness now that was different from the controlled anger he had seen before. This was something colder and more precise, the stillness of a person who has just understood not only that they were wronged, but that the wronging was more deliberate and more complete than they had previously known. "He knew," she said, "when he came here and told me it was a robbery. He knew what had happened. He looked me in the face and he told me it was a robbery." "Yes," Tobias said. There was nothing else useful to say, and he was not a man who spoke when there was nothing useful to say. She sat very still for a long moment. Then she said, "Is there anything in the letter about what happens next? Specifically, what we should do until the marshals arrive?" "Stay on the property as much as possible," he said. "Don't give Greer or Aldous reason to think anything has changed." "And you?" "I will stay," he said. She looked at him. "The letter says 2 weeks. That is not a short time to impose on someone." "You are not imposing," he said. "You keep saying that. It keeps being true." She picked up the letter again and read it through once more, and he watched her process it with the same methodical attention she brought to everything, and thought that he had known many capable people in his life, and that the quality of her capability was unlike anything he had encountered, because it was not the sharp, calculating capability of someone who has trained for a situation, but the deep, slow capability of someone who has built it from necessity, day by day, alone. "I want to be there when they come," she said. "The marshals, I want to be in the room." "You will be," he said. "You are a witness and you have evidence. They will need you." "I am not asking for permission," she said, with a sharpness that was not directed at him, but at the general assumption she had encountered throughout these 8 months that the decisions affecting her life were things that happened to her rather than things she was part of. "I know you are not," he said. "I am telling you that your presence is necessary and that I will say so directly to the marshals when they arrive." She held his gaze. There it was again, that small shift, that movement of something behind her eyes that was not yet named but was present and growing. "All right," she said. "Thank you." The 2 weeks before the marshals arrived were in some ways the most ordinary days of the whole of it, and in other ways the most significant. The harvest continued. The farm had its daily requirements, and they met them together with a rhythm that developed between them naturally, without discussion, the way rhythms develop between people who are paying attention to each other. She knew before he said anything when he had spotted something that needed fixing. He knew before she asked what she needed him to carry. Clara moved between them with the easy confidence of a child who has decided that a situation is acceptable and therefore is, chattering and asking questions and appointing herself supervisor of operations in ways that somehow did not feel intrusive. She was the one who broke it. She looked back at the shelves. "You should know," she said conversationally, as if the preceding moment had not occurred, "that I am not a woman who does anything without thinking about it carefully." "I know that," he said. "I am not in a position," she said, "to think carelessly about anything." "I understand that," he said. "Clara is watching everything," she said. "She always has been, even when she seems to be talking about the chickens." "I have noticed that," he said. She was quiet for a moment, placing jars on the shelf with precision. "I am also not a woman," she said. "Who would allow something to begin if she was not prepared to let it continue?" He was very still. "I am just telling you," she said, "what kind of woman I am." "I know what kind of woman you are," he said quietly. She turned and looked at him again, and this time she let the look last as long as it needed to last, which was a while. "Do you?" she said, not challenging, just asking. "You are the kind who keeps notes for 8 months," he said. "Who names every chicken on the farm after careful consideration. Who accepts a loan at fair market interest. Who looked at Ruddy Fane in her doorway without blinking. Who sat with me the first night I came here and asked me to tell her everything when most people would have asked me to leave." He paused. "You are the kind who, when her world fell apart, did not stop building. The jar she was holding was set down on the shelf very carefully. "You have been watching me," she said. "Yes," he said. "I have." Neither of them moved for a moment. Then she said, "I have been watching you too." It was not a kiss. Not that day. It was an acknowledgement, and an acknowledgement in Miriam Oleander's world carried as much weight as most people's declarations. She went back to the shelves and he helped her finish the root cellar. And when they came up into the afternoon air, Clara was sitting on the porch step, dissecting an almanac with the focused energy of a small scholar, and looked up at them without particular interest and said, "Margaret got out again." The marshals arrived on the 1st of November. There were two of them, older men with the specific competence of people who have been doing a job well for a long time and have no interest in theatrical displays of it. Their names were Marshal Hardin and Deputy Marshal Fitch, and they arrived quietly, without announcement, which was the right call given the presence of Greer in the county apparatus. They met at the Oleander farm, and Miriam sat at the table while they spoke and presented everything she had, every note, every date, every observed detail, with the precision and composure of a witness who has rehearsed nothing because she has simply been living with the truth for 8 months and knows it better than anything. Tobias watched Hardin watching her and saw the older man's assessment shift in the way assessments shift when someone exceeds expectation, and felt a satisfaction that was entirely on her behalf. They were there for 3 days. During that time, things moved with the specific momentum of federal authority that has been properly prepared and properly motivated. Aldous was approached with warrants. Greer was taken by surprise at the sheriff's office by Fitch, and a territorial officer who had come up from the border specifically for this purpose. Cutter, who was the man who had killed Daniel, was not in Caldwell Creek and had not been for months, but Hardin was confident about where he was and communicated this confidence in a way that suggested the confidence was well-founded. 2 of Aldis's men tried to run on the 2nd day and were caught before they reached the territory line. Fane was not part of the criminal operation, as it turned out, though his interest in the Oleander farm had clearly been connected to advanced knowledge of Aldis's plans for the land. When the operation came down around Aldis, Fane's interest in the Oleander property evaporated with a speed that told its own story. On the 3rd evening, when Hardin and Fitch were preparing to go, Hardin asked Miriam directly whether she needed anything from the federal authority that he could facilitate. She said that she needed Daniel's death reclassified in the county record from robbery to murder, that she needed the specific location of his burial recorded officially so that she could place a proper marker, and that she needed it on record that the Oleander Farm's south pasture had been used without consent. Hardin wrote all 3 things down in his record book. "Is there anything else?" he asked. She said, "I would like my husband's name to be remembered correctly. He was an honest man who tried to do the right thing." Hardin said, "It will be." When the marshals had gone, Miriam stood in the yard for a long time. Tobias stood nearby, but not too near, because he had learned in the past weeks how to read the difference between the moments when she wanted presence and the moments when she wanted proximity. This was a presence moment. The sun was setting in the way it only sets over flat Kansas country, painting the whole sky in gradients of orange and pink that had nowhere to end. And she stood in it with her face turned slightly up, and her eyes moving across the horizon with an expression that was, for the first time since he had arrived on her porch with the watch, fully open. Not performing composure, not managing grief, just there. Clara appeared from the direction of the barn and came and stood beside her mother and took her hand, and the 2 of them stood together in the sunset light. After a while, Clara turned and looked at Tobias where he was standing at the edge of the yard. "Are you going now?" she asked. The question landed in the air. Tobias looked at Clara. Then he looked at Miriam, who had turned also, and was watching him with the same expression she had worn in the root cellar, the one that was not a question but was waiting for him to answer one anyway. He thought about the road. He thought about 12 years of moving in the spaces between things. He thought about the watch in Daniel Oleander's coat pocket, and the specific quality of a promise made to a dying man and the different quality of a promise that has not yet been made but is already felt. "No," he said. "If I am wanted here." Miriam was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "We have a wheel on the wagon that needs proper fixing, and the north fence line is going to need work before winter closes in," Clara said, "and Margaret respects you. She doesn't respect everyone." He looked at them both. "Then I will stay," he said. The winter that followed was the best and also the hardest of Miriam Oleander's adult life, and she thought about this paradox often while it was happening. The best because she was not alone in it. Tobias fixed the north fence. He fixed the wagon wheel. He and Clara built a small shelter for Margaret that was warmer than the barn corner she had been occupying, a project that Clara supervised with the precision of an architect, and that Tobias executed with the patience of a man who has learned that some things are worth doing exactly as specified. He learned the farm not the way he had at first, with competence, but the way you learn a place that is becoming yours, with intimacy, with attention to its specific qualities, with the knowledge of which board on the porch step creaked and which post on the fence was the strong one to lean against. He and Miriam talked in the evenings as they had from the beginning, but the texture of the conversation changed. It had been, in the beginning, organized around survival and investigation, and it remained practical because they were practical people. But it became also something else, something that had the quality of two people discovering, detail by detail, the full dimensions of who the other person was. She told him about growing up in Missouri, the youngest of 5 children in a family that had land but not money, and that dealt with this by working with a thoroughness that she had inherited and would probably never shake. She told him about coming to Kansas with Daniel, about the first year on the farm when they had almost nothing and ate a great deal of cornbread, and were, she said, without sentimentality, very happy anyway. He told her things he had not told anyone in a long time. He told her about growing up in Texas, about his father who was a decent man and his mother who was an extraordinary one. He told her about the years after the war, which had taken him in directions he was not always proud of, and about the slow process of finding his way back towards something he could respect about himself. He told her these things carefully, not performing confession but simply telling the truth, because she had been telling him the truth, and it seemed like the only fair response. She listened to all of it with the attention she brought to everything, and she said, "You have been harder on yourself than the evidence requires." "I am not sure about that," he said. "I am," she said. "You have done things that were wrong, so has everyone I respect. The question is whether you kept moving towards something better, and you did. You are." He looked at her in the lamplight. "How did you know that?" he said. "I have been watching you," she said simply, returning his words from the root cellar back to him. "For 2 months now. It is enough time to know the shape of a person." This was the evening they sat closer to each other than they had before without it being accidental, and when she said good night, she rested her hand on his arm for a moment, just briefly, just enough, and he covered her hand with his before she took it away. And they both acknowledged this without speaking, and then she went in, and he went to the barn and lay in the clean hay and felt his heart doing things it had not done in a long time, possibly ever. Clara, as predicted, noticed everything. She did not say anything directly because she was 6 and had good instincts, and she seemed to understand that this was one of those adult situations that were not hers to manage. But her behavior shifted in small ways that were, in their aggregate, extremely clear. She began setting 3 places at the table without being asked. She began referring to Tobias in her conversations with the chickens, and with Margaret as Tobias who lives here, which was not quite accurate but was heading somewhere. She asked him one morning with the directness that was fully her mother's whether he thought he would be around in the spring, because if he was, she had a plan for a garden. "I think so," he said. "Good," she said. "I am going to grow peas." "Mama says peas are difficult, but I think she just hasn't had the right approach." "What is the right approach?" he said. "You have to talk to them," she said with complete seriousness. "Like the chickens." "That makes sense," he said. "You are a good listener," she said. "You would be good at the peas." He thought he might need to walk away for a moment to manage his face. He did not walk away. He sat with the complete seriousness of a man who is being trusted with important agricultural information. Christmas that year was small by most measures, but large by the measure of what it held. Miriam made a pie with apples that Francis Doyle, who had become something approaching a friend through the shared experience of the trial, had brought from her sister's tree. Clara received a book, a real one, from the general store in Caldwell Creek that Tobias had ridden in specifically to buy, and her reaction was the kind of reaction that is too genuine for display. The kind where she went very still and held it with both hands, and then looked at him with an expression that was her mother's exactly. After Clara went to bed on Christmas Eve, Tobias gave Miriam something he had been carrying for 3 weeks trying to decide how to present. It was a small framed picture, a daguerreotype, that he had found in a studio in Caldwell Creek, of a farm in summer. Not her farm specifically, but one that looked enough like it to carry the feeling of it, the flat horizon and the wide sky and the square, solid lines of a house built to last. He had bought it because he had wanted to give her something that said, without words, that he saw what she had built. She held it and looked at it for a long time. "This is us," she said. "Not a mistake, not a misreading, deliberately." "Yes," he said. She looked at him, and the composure she had been carrying since October broke, not dramatically but quietly, the way a stone wall becomes a garden gate, not by falling but by someone opening it from the inside. She leaned forward and kissed him, softly and deliberately, with the same quality of intent she brought to everything, and he kissed her back, and it was the simplest and most significant thing that had happened in that house in a very long time. When she pulled back, she was not embarrassed. She was herself. "I want to be clear," she said softly. "You always are," he said. "I am not a woman who does things by halves," she said. "If this is going somewhere, it is going somewhere real." "I know," he said. "I want it to go somewhere real." "Then we are agreed," she said, with a composure that was almost but not quite hiding the fact that she was profoundly moved, and which he found so completely her that it made his chest ache. "We are agreed," he said. The trial concluded in January. Aldous received a federal conviction for cattle theft, conspiracy, and complicity in the death of Daniel Oleander and the earlier death of Francis Doyle's husband, Philip Doyle, whose case was reopened as a result. Greer was convicted of corruption and obstruction. Cutter, who had been located in the Nations as Hardin had predicted, was brought back to Kansas and tried separately for Daniel's murder and convicted on that charge. The convictions did not restore what was lost. Miriam said this once quietly, to Tobias in the kitchen after the final verdict was reported, that there was not a legal outcome in the world that restored what a person lost, but that there was something in the fact that the truth had been spoken publicly and recorded, and that Daniel's name had been cleared of whatever shadow might have clung to it in the minds of those who did not know him, and that the people responsible were not free, and that this was not nothing. "No," he said, "it is not nothing." She sat with that. He would have been glad, she said, not triumphant. He was not a triumphant man, but glad that it was right. "Tell me about him," Tobias said. She looked up. "You told me what he said at the end," she said. "And I have told you facts about him. But I do not know who he was to you the way you knew him, however briefly." She paused. "And I would like to." So she told him. She told him about Daniel's patience and his humor and his serious approach to minor decisions and his loose approach to major ones. She told him about the singing which Clara had remembered correctly, how he sang while he worked, not well but with commitment. She told him about the way he had loved Miriam, which she described without sentimentality and with a specificity that honored what it had been, which was real and good and hers, and which had ended too soon and which she would always carry. "He would have liked you," she said. "He was a good judge of people, and he would have liked you." "I liked him," Tobias said. "In the hour I knew him, I liked him a great deal." She nodded. The grief in the room was present but not crushing. It was the grief that has been lived with long enough to become part of the architecture, not a weight but a room. "Thank you for bringing the watch back," she said. "Thank you for asking me to stay," he said. She reached across the table and took his hand. This was the first time she had done this, reached for him, and it was very different from him covering her hand in the dark. This was Miriam Oleander reaching for something she wanted. He turned his hand and held hers, and they sat at the kitchen table in the January cold, with the fire banked for the night and the lamplight low. And it was the quietest and most certain thing he had ever been part of. The spring arrived in southern Kansas the way it always did, with an argument. There were late frosts and a wind that could not decide what temperature it wanted to be and mud that made the roads difficult and the yard worse. Clara's peas went in on the first warm day of March, accompanied by a lengthy motivational address that she delivered to the prepared soil with the earnestness of a person who believes in what she is doing. And Tobias assisted and offered encouragement to the peas as requested. He was also, in the spring, fixing things. Not just repairing what was broken, but building what was needed, expanding what was there, because the farm was going to be, it was clear, a better operation than it had been before the events of the previous year, not because of what had happened, but because of the combination of Miriam's understanding of the land and Tobias's practical capacity, and the particular energy that comes from two people working toward the same thing together. He knew how to build. He had not remembered this about himself until he was doing it again, and finding it in himself again after a long time of not doing things that built anything permanent felt like coming into a room that had been waiting for him. He asked her to marry him in April, on a Sunday afternoon, on the porch, with Clara inside conducting some kind of research project involving the almanac and 2 years' worth of weather patterns that she had asked Tobias to help her collect. He asked her without preparation, which is to say with a great deal of preparation, which is to say that the words had been in him for weeks, and the moment simply arrived, and he let them out. He said, "I want to stay on this farm and work this land and be here when Clara asks questions about the peas and be here when the fences need work in the winter and be here at the table in the evenings." He said, "I want to be here because this is where I want to be and because you are the person I want to be near and because whatever I was looking for in 12 years of moving around, this is what it looks like." He said, "I am asking you to marry me. You do not need to answer now." She said, "Yes." No elaboration, no qualification, no conditions. Just yes, simply and completely, the way she did everything that she meant. He kissed her on the porch in the April sun, and she held onto his coat with both hands and kissed him back with an openness that she had been building toward since the first evening he sat at her table, since the root cellar, since Christmas Eve. And it was the kind of kiss that is not the beginning of something but the arrival at something. The moment when a journey that was not recognized as a journey resolves into the place it was always heading. Clara appeared in the doorway behind them with the almanac and the specific expression of a child who has assessed a situation and found it acceptable. Finally, she said, they were married in June. The ceremony was in the yard of the Oleander farm, not in the church, though the Methodist minister performed it, because Miriam said the yard was where her life was and where she wanted to begin the next part of it, and no one argued. Francis Doyle attended and wept with the satisfaction of a person who has invested in an outcome and seen it pay. Clara stood beside her mother and held the watch, which Miriam had placed in her small hand specifically for the ceremony, because the watch was family history, and Clara was old enough to be trusted with family history, and because bringing Daniel into the day seemed right rather than wrong, a recognition of continuity rather than a shadow over new beginning. Tobias Bright, who had spent 12 years going nowhere in particular, stood in the June sun on the farm that was now his as much as it was Miriam's, and made promises that he made with his whole self. Not a single reservation held back, not a single corner of himself still facing the door. The minister pronounced them husband and wife. Clara handed the watch back to her mother, who fastened it to a chain she had bought in Caldwell Creek and hung it around her own neck. It rested against her collarbone for the rest of the day, and she touched it once, lightly, at a quiet moment near evening when the guests had mostly dispersed, and she was standing at the edge of the yard watching the sunset, and Tobias came and stood beside her, and she leaned into him and he put his arm around her, and they stood there the way married people stand when they have earned their quiet, solidly, and without apology. The years settled around them the way good years settle, not without difficulty, but with the resilience of something that has been properly built. The farm grew. Tobias had a genuine gift for reading land that surprised even Miriam, who knew her own soil with depth, and together they expanded the operation into the south pasture, once it was fully and officially theirs again in every legal sense, and into a second crop that proved, by the second year, to be a genuine return on effort. Clara's peas were a success from the first season. She reported this to the chickens with the composure of someone who had always known it would work out. In the spring of 1881, Miriam told Tobias she was expecting a child. He went very still and then sat down, which was not his usual response to things, and she watched him process it with the patient attention she had always brought to watching him. And after a moment he looked up at her, and she saw something on his face that she had not seen there before, a vulnerability that was not distress, but something closer to awe. "Are you all right?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "I am very much more than all right." He reached for her hands. "Are you?" "Yes," she said. "I am happy, Tobias. I wanted you to know that plainly. I am genuinely happy." He brought her hands to his mouth and held them there for a moment. The baby arrived in November of 1881. A boy, born during a rainstorm that rattled the windows of the farmhouse with a thoroughness that Clara reported to Margaret through the barn wall, as if the cow were a concerned party requiring updates. He was a solid, healthy baby with his father's gray eyes and his mother's temper, which announced itself immediately and comprehensively. They named him Daniel James Bright. The Daniel was Miriam's, and Tobias accepted this without question or hesitation, because he understood the continuity of it, and because the name felt right on the baby in the way that names sometimes do, like it had been waiting for someone to grow into it. Clara was, from the first moment she was allowed to hold him, completely devoted, She approached little Daniel with the same serious attention she brought to almanacs and agricultural projects, studying him with an intensity that suggested she was taking notes. She informed him, within the first week, about the personalities of all the chickens, about the correct approach to growing peas, and about the importance of reading everything available, and she appeared to consider his inability to respond as a temporary obstacle rather than a fundamental one. "He will be a good listener," she told Tobias, looking down at the baby. "Like you." "I hope so," he said. "He already looks like he is thinking very hard," she said. "He might just be digesting," Tobias said. "It can be both," Clara said. Miriam said that she knew. She did know. She had known it since the evening Tobias had come back from the barn to say good night through the kitchen window, and she had seen him in the lamplight, and understood with the specific certainty of a clear-eyed woman that she was not moving away from what she had lost, but toward what she was still capable of, which was considerable. In the winter of 1882, Tobias finally told Miriam the full extent of what he had done before he arrived on her road, not because she required it of him, but because he wanted there to be nothing between them that he had not offered. He told her about the years after the war, and the things he had done that were not wrong in the literal legal sense, but that he wished had been different. He told her about the period when he had been a hired man for operations that were in the gray space between legitimate and not, and about the specific calculation he had made about each one, which was that he would not do things he knew to be actively harmful to people who had done nothing to deserve harm, and that this line had sometimes been easier to maintain and sometimes harder. She listened to all of it. "Is there anything you have not told me?" she said when he was done. "No," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "You are a better man than you were," she said. "That is what matters to me, not the before, the continuing. You are very certain about that." "I am very certain about you," she said simply. He looked at her across the kitchen table, where they had sat so many times in so many configurations of need and trust and discovery, and felt the full weight of what his life had become, which was heavier and also lighter than anything he had carried before, heavier because it mattered, lighter because he was not carrying it alone. "I love you," he said. He said it plainly, the way he said things when he meant them completely. "I love you," she said back in the same plain way. "I have for some time." How long? She considered this with the honesty she always brought to direct questions. "Since the root cellar," she said. "I would say the root cellar specifically, though it was earlier than that in its beginning." "For me it was earlier than the root cellar," he said. "When?" she said. "The morning after I arrived," he said. "When you sat down across from me with your coffee and told me to tell you everything, and I realized that you meant it and that you were entirely capable of handling it." She looked at him. "That was the morning after you arrived," she said. "We had known each other for one night." "I know," he said. She was quiet a moment. "That is very fast." "I am generally decisive," he said. She smiled at him, the full version, the one that had been emerging since Christmas Eve of 1879 and was by now so familiar and so entirely hers that it still did something to him every single time. "I know you are," she said. In the spring of 1884, Clara turned 11 and received, as her birthday gift, a real school enrollment in Caldwell Creek, which had acquired a proper schoolhouse and a teacher from Ohio who was, by all reports, genuinely educated. This was Tobias's arrangement, though he had discussed it with Miriam first, because the decision belonged to both of them and to Clara, and Clara's response upon being told was to sit very still for a long moment and then say, "Will there be more books than the almanac and the Bible and the Kit Carson novel?" "Considerably more," Tobias said. "All right," she said, with the composure of someone receiving extremely good news at a volume they are controlling carefully. Then I think that is correct. She rode to school in Caldwell Creek with a seriousness of purpose that impressed the teacher from Ohio within the first week, and came home with questions and observations, and a ferocity of engagement with the material that filled the kitchen table conversations in a new way, layering over the farm talk and the practical planning with something that had the quality of the future arriving. Little Daniel, at 2.5, had opinions about everything and the vocal commitment to express them, and was, as Clara had predicted, a very good listener between expressing his opinions. In the autumn of 1884, Miriam discovered she was expecting again. She was 32 and Tobias was 38, and they had been married 5 years, and the news landed between them with a joy that was uncomplicated, which surprised her slightly, because she had expected some complicated feeling around it and found instead only the simple, clear thing. "Another one," Tobias said, and his face did the thing it had done when she had told him about Daniel, the thing that was awe and vulnerability together. "Another one," she confirmed. "Are you well?" "I am very well," she said. He put his arms around her, and she stood in them in the kitchen in the autumn morning while the baby monitor of little Daniel's chatter came from the yard, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and let herself simply be held for a moment, which she had learned in 5 years of marriage to Tobias Bright was something she was allowed to need, and that he was capable of providing without condition or diminishment. The baby arrived in May of 1885, a girl this time, and she was born in the early morning before the sun was fully up and came into the world with a composure that seemed specific to her, as if she had decided how she wanted to do this and was executing accordingly. They named her Rose Margaret Bright, the Margaret for Miriam's mother, and also, as Clara immediately and correctly pointed out, for the cow. "She is named after Margaret the cow," Clara said, with more delight than accusation. "She is named for 2 important Margarets," Miriam said. Clara reported this to Margaret the cow with obvious satisfaction. The farm in the spring of 1885 was not the same farm that Miriam Oleander had been fighting to keep in the autumn of 1879. It was larger, more established, more productive, built out by the 2 of them in a collaboration that had created something better than either of them could have achieved separately, which was, Miriam thought, the definition of what they were to each other. The south pasture was producing grain. The fence line that Daniel had noticed someone repairing was their fence now, solid and correct, strung in Tobias's way and Miriam's, which had turned out to be compatible. There were new outbuildings. There was a school enrollment and an accounting book that was not desperate. There was a baby named for 2 Margarets and a 2-year-old boy who had his grandfather's name and his father's eyes and his mother's temper, and there was Clara, 11 years old, and rereading every book she had already read while waiting for more, who had Margaret the cow's complete trust and the chicken's complete regard, and who was, as she had always been, the specific wonder of the household. On a Sunday in June of that year, Miriam sat on the porch in the evening with little Rose in her arms and little Daniel asleep inside, and Clara in the yard reading in the last of the light, and Tobias came and sat beside her. He had been repairing the roof on the new outbuilding all afternoon, and he was dusty and tired in the particular good way of a man who has done something useful with his body and his hands. He sat beside her, and she leaned into him the way she had at their wedding in the sunset, and he put his arm around her the way he had then. The watch was around her neck. It was always around her neck. He touched it, gently, where it lay at her collarbone. "Do you know what I think?" he said quietly. "Tell me," she said. The same words she had said to him the night he arrived, the same tone, the same completeness of invitation. "I think he knew," Tobias said, "when he asked me to bring the watch back." I think he knew that whoever brought it back would stay. She was quiet. Daniel was perceptive, she said finally. He was, Tobias said. He said in the engraving that you carry my heart wherever you ride, she said. I wrote that in 1878. I did not know then that the person carrying it would be someone other than him, or that it would bring that person to me. She looked at the horizon, the Kansas sky enormous and full of the particular color that June evening has in this country, the color that is almost more than a color, that is close to a feeling. I have thought about that, whether it is strange. Is it strange to you? No, she said. It feels like something that made sense out of itself. I could not have designed it, but here it is. Here it is, he agreed. Clara looked up from her book and across the yard at them and apparently satisfied herself that the situation was stable, returned to her reading. Little Rose in Miriam's arms made a small sound that was not distress, but something more like commentary, the early version of an opinion, and Miriam adjusted her gently and she settled. She is going to be exactly like Clara, Tobias said. Yes, Miriam said. God help us. I think we will manage, he said. She turned her head to look at him. This man who had arrived on her porch with a dead man's watch, and a dark past, and a quiet way of being present that had turned out to be the most dependable thing she had ever encountered. And she thought about all of it, every day of it, the grief and the investigation and the root cellar and Christmas Eve, and the trial and the wedding in the yard, and 5 years of the daily building of something real. Tobias, she said. Yes, he said. I am glad you came, she said. He looked at her. I am glad you asked me to stay, he said. The evening settled around them in the way that good evenings settle on the Kansas plains, wide and warm and without particular urgency, the kind of evening that has nowhere to be and no intention of hurrying. Clara read in the fading light until it was too dark to read, and then came in without being asked, because she had reached a stopping point that satisfied her. Little Rose slept against her mother's chest. The stars came out over southern Kansas one by one in the vast, unhurried way they always had. The same stars that had been over this prairie for all the years of it, over the buffalo grass and the longhorn trails and the farm roads and the small lights of the towns that had arrived and argued with each other about what this country was for. And the Oleander farm sat in all of that under those stars with its lights on, and its fences solid, and its people inside. Tobias Bright, who had once been a man who moved through the spaces between things and called that living, was home. The watch was on its chain. The peas had come in again. The almanac was on the shelf, annotated in Clara's handwriting from margin to margin. The baby was asleep. The boy would be awake before the sun. And Miriam Oleander, who had held herself together with nothing but will and the daily necessity of continuing, who had kept notes for 8 months in the dark and lit the lamp every morning anyway, who had asked a quiet stranger to tell her everything and then asked him to stay, sat in the June evening and was wholly and without reservation at peace. This was what it looked like. This was what had been possible all along. On the other side of everything, she had found her way to it. He had found his way to her, and they had arrived finally at the good thing, the real thing, the thing that was theirs.